Welcome, everyone. My guest today is Managing Editor James Kleimann to talk about the CFPB's new request for information on mortgage junk fees and what's happening to the number of realtors. Is it a conspiracy or just market forces behind a decline in those numbers? James, welcome back to the podcast.
Good to be back.
Great to have you back, especially when we have so many things to talk about. So the first thing on my list would be the CFPB and their new request for input based on something we've been doing a lot of reporting around, and that is junk fees. Tell us what's going on there.
I think we should probably put the term junk fees in quotation marks because it really it depends on who you ask in the industry, outside of the industry, what constitutes a so-called junk fee. I think it's pretty charged language, right? Like it sort of suggests that you're getting a bunch of stuff you don't want or you don't need or shouldn't be there in the first place. And sorry, my cat is going crazy in the background. But really what it comes down to for the industry is a lot of these so-called junk fees that the CFPB says are not advantaging consumers and that they don't have any choice over, that these are just packed in there. And if the lender says they need title insurance, well, you get stuck paying for it and you have no choice in the matter, right? And that's one example. Credit checks, right? Every time you get a credit report, and that's going to be frequent throughout the life cycle of a mortgage application, that's going to be charged to you, and you don't have much control over that, right? If the lender says, I need this or I need that, or different investors have different requirements. And from the mortgage industry's perspective, well, one, who requires these things? It's not the mortgage industry just saying, oh, well, we certainly do need to make sure that you have this or that or the other thing. In almost every case, these fees, with a few exceptions, are coming from requirements set by the investors, generally speaking, Fannie, Freddie, Ginnie, or their requirements from some federal guideline, or they are something that the mortgage industry can't get around, right? Like you need a FICO score, you need credit reports to determine, and these are the types of fees that the industry says, like, look, this is just how it works. We're not the ones who sat here in Washington, D.C. 12, 13, 14 years ago and decided to write up these rules. Like, you guys did this. We've spent the last 10 plus years spending a lot of money, a lot of manpower trying to figure out how to comply, how to make this process work so that we are serving the customer. No one is surprised. All the disclosures are out there. And we've finally done that. And now it sounds like you might be looking to play a new game. And so there is some concern when you talk to the folks at the Mortgage Bankers Association that the CFPB is looking to kind of make an attempt around the traditional rulemaking process. And this might be the start of something. I don't think, just given a lot of the other contextual clues related to the CFPB's RFI, that this is exactly what they're doing. But certainly they have made pretty clear that they want to start looking and scrutinizing some of the credit report fees, some of the fees that the consumer really just has no control over, and how that manifests in what regulatory process is still really not yet clear.
I think that's such a good point. Like, what is a junk fee? And to your point, interesting that that's what they're calling it. The CFPB has been calling it, when the mortgage industry is like, listen, it's not something we came up with. And I think that why the MBA and others in lending would be so wary of another rulemaking process is how long it took to do the QM rules, and then they revisited them a couple years ago, and it took 18 months. I mean, and it's a crazy process. It's a very it's not a straightforward process, and in the meantime, the lenders have to adapt and make sure they're doing it. And all of those actually add costs to the lenders. Anytime you make a new policy, unless it's very straightforward, I mean, you're adding cost into the process, which then gets passed to the borrowers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and from the CFPB's perspective, I don't think that they're so casual as to say, like, well, that's business. You have to deal with whatever, the regulations are. But their remit is in serving the consumer, not the industry. And I think people in industry are pretty clear about what their relationship looks like. But from the CFPB's perspective, these fees are rising in cost. And in 2022, the median dollar amount in closing costs rose by more than a third. And it was roughly $6,000 in 2022. And so, you add that to the increase in home prices and interest rates and just all the pressure that puts on a borrower's budget. And that means that they have less access to credit, right? It means that home affordability is lower. And so if the CFPB can come up and say, well, hey, Mr. Lender, you're the one who's charging these borrowers for title insurance. The borrower is paying for it, but it protects you, not the borrower in a traditional technical sense. Maybe we should be opening the door to more competition there, right? I mean, I don't think that anything in the CFPB's RFI suggests that they want to do away with title insurance, but certainly they want to target areas in which the consumer has no say and no choice. And so if that means that industry now has to take the step and say, well, in the case of, let's say, refis that are, Fannie, Freddie purchase, maybe we now can negotiate directly with the title insurance company instead of it just being a number that is set, through various states by insurance regulators or, they don't really get into it all that much, but AMCs, right, appraisal management companies, this is another area. It is mentioned once in the RFI report, and they do point out that consumers have no say over this. I don't even think the average consumer has any idea what an AMC is, doesn't care, it doesn't, but if you want to look at what's contributing to some of these costs, I think you'll find it there. And again, these are just a couple examples.
It's a great example because, of course, AMCs were put in as part of, putting in a arm's length relationship between the lender and the appraiser after the great financial crisis, not by the lenders. So another great example.
I was going to say, Sarah, there are a couple things that the CFPB is really focused on right now. So the first, as I mentioned, is which fees are subject to competition and the market barriers that might limit that competition. But they're also looking at how these fees are set and who is profiting from them. So in a lot of cases, they're just passed. These are third-party vendor fees, and they're passed on from the mortgage lender to the borrower. And the IMB or whomever the lender might be, they're not actually collecting any of the money on it. They're passing it over, but maybe there is a third-party company that's, say, doing credit reports, right? Like maybe Experian is making money on this. And now you get into a situation where if the consumer has no rights, no choice, no means to resolve this cost, well, what if the CFPB is able to put some of those fees to the market, right? So that's one component. The other is, how are these fees changing and how are they affecting consumers? A lot of these large companies, especially in the credit reporting industry, they've got new models recently, right? And so I think the CFPB really wants to learn about who's benefiting from those services and whether the lenders have any say in it. And as we've noticed, certainly through conversations that we've had as reporters with IMBs and a lot of lenders, they're paying way more for these credit reports. They're paying way more, and they can't pass those on. They can't take the burden because they're already losing money, right? And so, and that also comes to some of the costs that they subscribe to. And so if you work at a large mortgage company and you need a CRM, right? Like you need a lot of tech fees and unless there are a couple that do it in-house that are proprietary, and that's probably one of the reasons they're able to create greater efficiencies than the average company. But the average company is subject to whatever these third-party vendors are charging. And it's often a bulk amount, right? Like it's wholesale prices. And if they don't change their fees, if they don't lower their fees, even though your business is down 40%, but you're still paying the same amount of money you did to do much less business, how do you resolve that, right? Like you're going to pass those costs on to the borrower. And so again, that's just yet another example of I think some of the things that the CFPB is looking at. And at the end of the day, what they're going to be focused on is the impact of closing costs on housing affordability. They're going to look at issues related to the access to ownership, home ownership, home equity. And so that's going to bring a lot of sort of subjects to the surface. It's going to be discount points, right? We've talked about that in the past, Sarah. We've talked about origination fees a little bit, right? I think in the end, if any of this is going to come to pass, what it probably means is the disclosure, this defense from the industry saying, well, look, every fee is disclosed. There's no mystery here, is not going to be good enough. And in some cases, you're going to have to break down exactly what's being charged and why. And the industry might have to, I guess, try to fight for themselves a little more, for lack of a better term, to try to push down some of these costs.
I think, you mentioned credit score costs, and that was definitely, you and I were at the MBA secondary conference. That was all over the agenda and, in conversations. It's clear that the government is not happy with the credit reporting agencies and with FICO for charging you. I think it's like 400% more than it used to be to get a credit pull. And as you and I talked about last week, that's multiple times during the process. And at the same time, credit reporting, as well as things like appraisal, we have technology now that's like, shouldn't that make it easier, less expensive, less of a burden on people? It's not like you have to do all these manual things for a credit pull these days. I mean, it should be something that could happen very quickly.
Right. And is the increase in cost commensurate with the amount of money that they're putting back into deploying better credit scoring models? They would argue that it is, and that they're trying to recoup some costs for a system that really hasn't changed in decades. And you know why the system hasn't changed in decades? Because it was profitable. It worked for some constituents and not as much for others. And I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of these price increases come as investors of various companies are seeking better returns. And, they want to get a little more juice, right?
Yeah, I also don't think that it's a coincidence that the FICO and Vantage Score, they've come up with a lot of different models, and the government has been like, no, we don't like those models. We're still going back there. I mean, when I started in 2013 at HousingWire, that was a big story. Like, oh, here's this new model. They didn't adopt it. They didn't accept it as Fannie and Freddie can't accept that. So it's like even all that innovation in some ways is sort of wasted if we're just going to use the same old models that we already did, or maybe one generation up, or but it's not like those credit scoring models help the lenders or the borrowers that much at this point.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think in general, the consumers are still going to pay all of these fees that the CFPB is targeting and scrutinizing, and it's just going to be done in the form of probably higher mortgage rates, and not different fees here and there. There's $1,000 origination fee. There's this tech fee. There's this title insurance fee. I think it's probably all just going to get baked into the rate, because consumers are still going to pay. That's never been, if industry now has to come up with all these costs when they're already not making money, they're going to figure out some other way that they can recoup some of the money. You can't have, the point of a business is to make money, right? That's what I've been told. Like, it's been a while since I've taken an econ course, but that's my recollection from way back in the day. And so if these businesses are perpetually not making money because the government is requiring that they eat these various costs to produce their product, they're going to figure out a way to put some of those other costs onto the consumer, or they go out of business and there is no industry. That's a little bit of an exaggeration. I think there's always going to be a need for housing finance. This is not a new business, right? This is predated Fannie, Freddie, the FHFA, the FHA, any number of government acronyms. We have had lenders who will finance home purchases for hundreds, thousands of years, but they need to make money. It has to be a durable business.
Has to be a durable business. And this, the last thing I'll say about this too, is that, it is, we understand the affordability problem, right? We have high mortgage rates. I mean, compared to the last couple of years, we have high home prices. We have high, property taxes and insurance. So we all understand that. And so you see, not just the CFPB, but a lot of parts of, the government and the agencies seeing where can they trim on the edges, because they can't really do anything about home prices. They can't really do anything about some of these other things. So they're trying to work on what they can, but, maybe with limited success. We'll have to see. I'm not the arbiter there, but.
But on that point, I feel like it's still a lot of nibbling around the edges. I don't think it's a bad thing that CFPB or other agencies or folks in sort of the upper echelon of housing policy are looking at closing costs. They're too high, straight up. They're just too high. It's fine that they look into all of these problems. There are many problems on the real estate side, on the housing finance side, on the title side, on the appraisal side. I think you and I individually could probably identify 5 major things that should be addressed on every one of those subjects. The real problem is the government doesn't have big ideas related to core supply and demand housing issues. More than half of the big Biden administration, problem solving, points of emphasis are pretty much entirely on boosting demand. And it's like, I just don't get it. And I know that there are limitations to what they can do related to, say, zoning issues or whatever, but nobody's out here saying, you know what, let's figure out something with capital gains. Let's figure out, there's a lot of ways you can sort of, try to boost supply. You can remove so many more barriers by providing block grants to municipalities or counties or others for, doing things the way you want them to be done, right? So you want to incentivize builders from, working beyond just their own base level incentives. Okay, throw some money at them, right? I know it's not politically popular to say we're going to give home builders who are traditionally run by pretty wealthy investors, right? Giving them more money to do something, but it's a critical faculty of the economy. It's a critical piece of the American experience, right? You need houses. We are way undersupplied, at minimum 1.5 million homes. How are we going to get there? There's no freaking plan. There's no plan. We talked last week about this idea that there should be a housing czar in this country. I absolutely agree. The problem is, if you look at other areas, look at the drug czars that we've had, or look at other areas in which we've had czars, what's happened? The needle just hasn't moved. So, I think it's a nice political talking point. We need a single person who's responsible to look down at all of the various housing policy issues, and there are many, all the way down to building codes, zoning codes, all kinds of crazy regulation in mortgage and banking and technology, and just the slowness of government to do anything. Why are DPA programs taking months to do? Months to do. These are government issues, right? The government just, I don't see enough big ideas. I think that's a problem. I know they're not great at executing small, medium, or big ideas in recent terms. I mean, maybe in years past, maybe in decades past, but lately it just doesn't seem to be getting off the ground. But I don't see any moonshots either, and so that's.
Last week when we were at that MBA conference, Flavia Furlan Nunez, she's our senior mortgage reporter, and we sat down with Adrienne Todman, who's the acting secretary of HUD, and she talked about this whole, one person in charge. And I said, well, is that you? Does that? Well, I think what I said is, does that belong to HUD? And she said, well, we have housing in our name. It feels like it does. And so I'm like, listen, Acting Secretary Todman, step up. Let's do it. Let's see it. We will support that 100%. You be that person, because it is really difficult. And HUD in different administrations has been a backwater. At least in the Biden administration, they have been given a lot of responsibility and have been pulled to the forefront in a lot of ways that, I mean, for a couple of decades, it was HUD, what are they doing? You know what I mean? They were not in the room where the decisions were made.
Some of the Trump years were absolutely crazy. I remember I interviewed someone who was the head of public housing in New York, and she was, grossly unqualified to be doing this job. I knew way more about housing and policy than this person did, and it was embarrassing. And this is not, purely to say that this is a Trump administration issue only, but I don't think it's been taken seriously enough. And I think we're only starting to find that there's a lot more weight put in housing issues because it's gotten so crazy, Quano crazy in the last couple of years that it's a major election conversation point, right? So look at all the swing states. A lot of them have huge upticks in rental costs, big upticks in housing price costs. I mean, everyone really has as well. But, you want to mobilize swing voters. That's what, unfortunately, the sad state of American electoral politics comes down to is, where are the purple states? How do we get them? And I think if you're a renter or are trying to buy in any of those markets, you're pretty disappointed at the state of affairs right now. And so it's not simply like a job that we give to, someone who shouldn't be getting the job, right? It matters.
And, we've talked to different housing leaders who have said housing is an opportunity to get some things done bipartisan because it affects everybody. And, we can see that when different Congress people want to stand up and talk about it. And, clearly they're feeling the heat from their constituents. Main Street kind of gets up. So we will see. So, okay, before we get to our next subject, I just have to say, don't you in New York City, don't you have a rat czar? Is that right?
Yeah. She's also, talk about political patronage. Unfortunately, Eric Adams, he has a lot of corruption scandals and investigations swirling. He's not well loved by New Yorkers. Not that any mayor really ever is in this city. It's a hard to please populace, but he elected some, his rat czars maybe not up to the task either. There are so many rats, but people don't know this, but like one of the reasons that you go to Chicago and you find that they don't really have the same rat problems that we have in New York is because they have alleyways. And so, they had the Great Fire way back in the day. And so the alleyways, like you put all your trash there, it's more difficult for the rats to get to. Here in New York, we just leave our trash out. It is Trash City, USA. It is absolutely disgusting. Depending on the neighborhood you're in, that you might just have trash strewn all over the place. And so they've recently started some new initiatives where you can't take your trash out until like 8 or 9 p.m., which, maybe that helps a little bit, but yeah.
No, listen, it's a huge difference. So, okay, I'm living in Texas. I go visit my kids in New York City, and I was like, what is going on here, right? And then this last time, I saw the difference. You can tell
it's a little better.
There's some things going on. Anyway,
they're trying to remove some of the street parking to put in these large, containerized garbage zones, which I am very much in support of. But removing street parking from New Yorkers, even though this is like the only city in America that has robust mass transit, is a politically unpopular thing to do. But that's really the only solution here is you remove street parking, you put in actual containerized, garbage and refuse collection. But anyway, we're getting off subject here.
So sorry. I'm sorry. Rat czar, I had to bring it up. Okay, switching topics. The other thing I wanted to talk about, you mentioned real estate earlier, is the whole sort of what's going on at the National Association of Realtors and their membership numbers. So this has been something that's been hard to see from the outside. Maybe you can bring us up to speed on why we're even talking about, what do those numbers look like?
So the numbers matter because, well, there are a couple of reasons the numbers matter, right? So one, I think they're generally a pretty good barometer of where we are in the housing market. So if there's more business, there are more sales, there's more money to be made, you typically find that there are more realtors, right? There are more agents, there are more people who wanna try to get on the action. When markets cool down, you start to see fewer agents who are making money, and thus it doesn't make sense for them to pay the various dues that are required to become a member of, say, the NAR or their state or local associations, which give them access to the MLS and, basically are the lifeblood of the industry. So we wanted to check in on what the membership looks like at NAR. And the thinking is, okay, we know that we're already in a down cycle. And it's often very telling to see how many realtors renew their membership. Usually that goes out in November. And so they have to send it back by January 1st to retain their membership. And it's like $150 plus $45 for their ad campaign. The less said about that, the better. We've covered that in previous episodes, and I don't want to be redundant here. And so anyway, at the end of December, let me pull it up here, there were 1,554,604 members of NAR. And that's still not far from the high point reached in the fall of 2022 when there were still a lot of sales. But certainly, things were slowing down. The Fed had already started hiking rates, and we were starting to see the beginning of really, this might be worse than we thought, right? So that was starting kind of the downslope. And right now, as of April 30th, so exactly a month ago, the National Association of Realtors reported that it had 1,509,195 members. So we're looking at a decline of about 45,000 members since December who elected not to renew. And there are a couple interesting points here. The first is, 45,000 might sound like a big number, but it's really not. I mean, we're talking about less than 3% of members, even with all the commission lawsuit talks, the lack of business for a lot of realtors. They're still electing to renew their memberships. I had a lot of questions about this. The first is, does NAR still expect there to be a decline in membership? And they do. And I want to be very clear about this. And they're not saying that it's a direct corollary to the commission lawsuits, which pretty much everyone expects will put pressure on buyer-side agents and commissions. So there's that component. However, there is a long tail to this, right? So when you make a decision as an agent, whether you're going to remain in the game, it's not immediate, right? Like a lot of these agents the vast majority of agents, first of all, I should say, are part-timers. There are probably about 400,000 to 500,000 full-time agents who are doing this day in and day out. And that's actually not that many when you consider the size and scope of the American housing market. So that means about, give or take, about 1 million real estate agents are doing it part-time. Many of them still see the value, apparently, in renewing their license and are presumably doing so also at the state and local association level as well, right? So that's one thing. There is, according to Lawrence Yoon, who's the chief economist at NAR, there is usually an 18 to 24-month lag between when we start to see the down of a market and the numbers actually dropping. A couple reasons. One, some of them are just holding out and thinking, all right, I'm going to make a couple more sales. I want to see where it goes. And if I don't do well, if it isn't worth the fee, which I think for most people would probably end up being between state, local, and NAR, probably like $500-$600 a year, right? If I'm not making like at least that each year, which should be at minimum one sale, right? Like 1-2 sales at minimum, then I'm just not going to renew the next year. And so you have a lot of them who also will hang on that second year. So maybe the theory would be that a lot of the numbers are still holding up right now, but would not be looking so rosy on January 2nd of 2025. Because at that point, we'll be firmly, 24 to 36 months into a pretty down cycle, historically speaking, for home sales and relatively high numbers of competitors. So that's kind of where we are right now. Another thing that I think we have to talk about for NAR on this is they've had their internet scrubbers getting to work, and they have been removing some of the historical state and national data on membership figures. And a lot of these go back, a very, very long time, decades and decades and decades of data. And they used to have it, on individual URLs, and you could go to the page and you can look up like, hey, how did it look like in 2013, right? Which was the low point in modern times for NAR membership, where it was about 968,000 members. How does that compare to today when it's about 1.5 million, right? So you could look at that previously. You can't do that anymore. They removed it all. They haven't really provided a good reason or any reason why it's been removed. So the public, doesn't have access to this data. NAR is saying that its members will have updated statistics going forward, but they haven't answered the question as to what happens to some of the historic data, who removed it, why it's been removed, and what that effort is going to look like going forward in terms of telling members and the broader public. They did tell me when I asked them for the latest statistics, so I want to give them credit for that. But I think it's a bad look no matter what. Like, let's take everything at face value and say, like, they're just reorganizing Occam's razor here. Like, the more likely, is the scenario is the one it is, that they're just reorganizing or doing something on the tech side. They have a different methodology that they're testing out or something. Like maybe that's, the reason. Then like, don't remove it and put a dead link up there. Like, don't be coy about it. Don't be weird about it. When people say, hey man, like what's going on? Why is all this stuff just disappeared from the internet, like without explanation, right? Like, I think it's one of the reasons that people are they don't trust NAR, because the communication, the lack of transparency, the lack of explanation is frustrating and it's confusing, and it makes people assume that maybe there's something worse or nefarious or something that shouldn't be happening that is happening. And I personally, I don't actually think that's the case. I think the number that they provided, the 1.509 million at the end of April, was probably the right one. I think it's probably going to be a very slow decline in numbers because you've already paid your dues. So, maybe some will drop out. Maybe some credit cards, didn't go through initially and then did go through and now they won't. But there's not a whole lot happens between January 2nd and, December 31st. But don't draw attention to it. Don't be weird about it. And NAR, as ever, is being weird about it. So it does, I think, unnecessarily antagonize people. And I want to point out also that there are a couple major big questions now related to the commission lawsuit changes. Obviously, the game has changed. And if you're a buy-side agent, you're now going to have to do a lot more work on the front end. You're going to have to get buyers to sign agreements with you. You're going to have to make sure that, they will be paying you if the seller decides not to compensate the buy side in the transaction, right? Like that game is going to change. And the pot of commissions at about $100 billion annually could shrink. It will probably shrink. Is it going to be as dramatic as Ryan Tomasello at KBW thinks, and that it will shrink, by $30 billion in the coming years? I don't know. That's very possible. There's other research out there that suggests that when there are changes on one side of the commission, say the sell side remains 3%, like there are compressions on the buy side, then more than half the agents end up leaving. This is older research. It didn't, it doesn't apply in real world applications because we haven't instituted these new rules. But I think it does suggest that if there is less money, if the pot is smaller, if there are fewer deals, and we already know existing home sales are not going to soar anytime soon, there's going to be fewer agents. Like it's supply and demand.
And it doesn't, to your point, it doesn't even mean like, oh, NAR's done such a bad job. People are, there's a lot going on here with the economy. Definitely the commission lawsuits are part of that, but I agree with you. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I would love to continue talking to you about this, but just wanted to let our readers know, we have these stories up on HousingWire.com, lots more detail in both of these stories, and we'll be doing follow-ups too, especially on the NAR thing. It's like, well, not just especially on the CFPB junk fee thing too. These are really important topics, and we know you guys are interested. So, James, thanks so much for being on.
I just had one more point because I think it's so important to mention. We actually do see an uptick in membership in certain states for NAR. And, you want to know where it is? It's in all the states that actually have housing inventory, right? So it's Florida, Florida and Texas combined to have about 40% of active inventory right now. That's where we're seeing increases in agents. Arkansas, again, same story, right? You're not seeing it in other areas in the Northeast and in, the West Coast, the coastal areas. This is at its core, as it always is, it's a story about supply and demand. We just don't have enough supply, which means we're not going to have as many real estate agents.
Great point. Thanks for bringing that up. James, thanks for being on, and I will talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Sarah.